Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast where we confront the deeper questions beneath our personal struggles and collective crises. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong. I'm not a theologian or a philosopher, or at least by training. I am a PhD exercise physiologist with an interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. In this episode, I will take you on a tour of my spiritual journey and what faith, religion, and the concept of God, cosmic purpose, and spirituality mean to me. And before we begin, please hit the like button, follow or subscribe depending on the platform you are listening or watching, and share this podcast with a friend. In this episode, I want to take you on a journey through the spiritual, specifically my spiritual journey. I can't have a podcast that confronts the problems of the world as spiritual problems without providing my foundation for what it means to be spiritual. This journey is by no means complete. In many ways, it's still in its infancy. I believe we are in the midst of a spiritual evolution. I believe we are on a path to what Teilhard would call the omega point. So here we go. My path was an interesting one. I was born Catholic. Don't remember much about being Catholic other than that I was baptized by sprinkling as a child, and we went to Catholic church for a period of time. And then at some point, my family started going to a Mormon church, was baptized again. So I got myself covered pretty well. Following the Mormon church, we went to a Methodist church. I've experienced a lot of different churches growing up as I've gone to visit family. And, my grandparents were Methodist. My aunt was Lutheran. My mom's side was Catholic. Religion was something that I was raised with, but not necessarily something that was drilled into me. I think a lot of my experience is driven by the fact that my father was probably much more driven toward exploration as his life was progressing as well. And so this brings me to college. College was an interesting period of time, as it is for all young people, as they begin to kind of question faith, question the path that maybe they have been brought up on. As I've mentioned many times on this podcast before, I studied geology as an undergrad. And in that exploration of being a geology major, I had to really kind of explore the question of creation versus evolution. And it was a challenging time for me because my faith had raised me that there was a 7-day creation, and that, God made the world in 7 days and that was it. And you get into studying evolution, suddenly it's like presented with this idea that there can't be a God because we have evolved over billions of years. And it was a struggle for me for a while. And as I really started to examine it, I turned to the Bible and I opened up Genesis and I read through Genesis and wow, this is the geological record spelled out for us. And so while I don't claim to have any solid knowledge or understanding of the creation process or Big Bang, I know that somewhere in between those different theories is the real God. And so that kind of pointed me back to faith. And then it was like, okay, well, where do I go from here? And I had a fraternity brother who was a born-again Christian, and he happened to show one evening at the fraternity house this movie. It was, I believe, from Campus Crusades for Christ, that showed all these NFL football players talking about their relationship with God and with Jesus. And it opened my eyes to that. Okay, well, it's not uncool to be a Christian. If these, football players, I kind of looked up to, football players at that point in time in my life. And I was like, if they can have a faith in God, then maybe I can too. And so I kind of went through the whole born again process, saying the little prayer, accepting Jesus as my Lord and Savior and doing all that. But it still left me with a search for how do I practice my faith? And that led me through numerous different explorations of churches. I attended a Pentecostal church that one of my coworkers went to, and it didn't feel right for me. I spent a period of time in the African Methodist Evangelical Church. I had a couple of coworkers who were basically studying and preparing to be pastors or ministers in that particular church, and they invited me to kind of check them out. And I went there for a while. I liked it, but I always felt kind of a little bit of an odd person out. And I also kind of was turned off by the behavior of these two particular gentlemen. And it's, again, not in any way a reflection on that particular faith or faith in general, but they just seemed, and again, they were young, and it wasn't that they were bad people or anything like that. But I just noticed that, their behavior didn't necessarily match what I would think as the behavior a pastor should be demonstrating. And it kind of just turned me off. And so I kind of moved away from that observation and then went to other churches. I think I probably went to a Methodist church for a while. I tried a few other different communities in Morgantown area where I was going to college. And it was really early on in my master's program. One Saturday morning, it was just, turned on the TV and there was a program about this gentleman, Herbert W. Armstrong, and having the same last name. It was like, wow, it caught my attention. Who is this Armstrong guy? He had just passed away and it was the World Tomorrow program, and they were kind of honoring the leader of their church, Herbert W. Armstrong. This was the Worldwide Church of God. And they offered a book. And I believe in my recent episode with John McGuire, I said it was The Wonderful World Tomorrow, and I was incorrect with labeling the book as that. It was The Mystery of the Ages. And I read that book, and it just struck me, this is where I need to be spiritually right now. And it talks a lot in terms of the Sabbath. And so I started exploring, where can I didn't know anything about the Worldwide Church of God at that point. Didn't even realize it was a church. And it was my grandfather who pointed me toward Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so I, checked that out. But to me, it wasn't much different than the other churches I was going to. And it wasn't for me at that point. Again, as I talk about different faiths and different churches that I've gone to, these aren't necessarily, indictments on those churches. I think every church has its point and its purpose. And for each of us, that's perhaps where we need to be in the moment. And that's certainly what I've realized over the course of my life. But I ultimately ended up finding the Worldwide Church of God. And I graduated from my master's program, moved back to Pittsburgh, started attending the church there. Spent a number of years in that church. And, my episode with John McGuire, we talk a little bit about, that experience. But it really led me to a different understanding of Christianity. It was a Sabbatarian church. Many would label it as quite legalistic. I don't necessarily feel that it was. For me, it was the experience that I needed at that moment. It gave me some structure. It gave me a way of demonstrating my faith. It taught me about the holy days and how they pointed to Jesus Christ and to God's purpose for us on earth. Was it complete? No. And was it accurate? Maybe not. But it gave me another step or another rung in the ladder I was climbing spiritually. And as time went on, I went off to college, got my PhD, and was working. Worldwide Church of God was making changes where it was becoming less and less of the church that I had first identified with and becoming much more of kind of mainstream Christianity. I wasn't experiencing from it what I really felt I needed. I wasn't feeling fed spiritually. And then I married my wife, Pam. She had been raised Catholic. She had gone a few different churches herself. She even explored Schwedensborgism, which probably most would not even know what that is. And I still don't fully understand what it is. But, she had her growth path as well. And our paths just kind of united at a point where we had to find our common journey. And so that led us to a number of different churches as we were living in Western Michigan. And, they were all good in their own way and bad in others. We took a trip to Cleveland, Ohio, and visited the church that Alistair Begg, who is a very popular minister, visited his church, and we're just blown away by how welcoming the people were. And, having come from an experience being in a church community where people just didn't seem aware of other people, it felt distant. And I remember one time, my son was just a toddler just an infant at the time. And we were sitting in the back and I was holding my son, and they bring the collection plate around to collect the offering. And whoever was carrying the plate completely bypassed a Hispanic woman, which I found very, very offensive, but also put the plate in front of me. And I'm like, I got my hands full of kid here. And my wife actually makes more money than me. She's holding the check for the offering. why aren't you putting it in front of her? So it was I'm seeing this kind of racial and gender bias that to me just wasn't Christ-like. And at that same church, when I would carry my son to change his diaper after church, I'd have to fight through the crowd of people that, they just didn't seem aware that we were there and that we needed to get through. And you're saying, excuse me, and nobody's moving. But when we went to Alistair Begg's church, it was totally different. It was just like people sensed that you were there and they would move. And it was just a very different experience. We just came back from that. We got to find another church. And that's when we were led to the Mars Hill Bible Church, which was led at the time by Rob Bell, who, again, many of the listeners and viewers might have varying opinions of Rob. His following as well as his detractors. But for us, the message that he brought us, it was the continuation of what I had learned in the Worldwide Church of God. And I just felt that spiritually, that's where I needed to be at that point. It gave me a very different perspective of the world and what was expected of me spiritually. And then we moved to Oregon, and then we ran into some of the same different conflicts in trying to find a church. And there were pluses and minuses, all the different churches that we found. And currently I attend and I'm a deacon in the Presbyterian Church. I love it. We have a great community there. Mm-hmm. Is that the epitome of the Christian faith? Probably not. And I don't believe anybody there actually believes that it is. There isn't that us or the highway kind of mentality. And I think that's a very important part of, as we find our spiritual journey, that where we are in the moment isn't necessarily where we're going to be tomorrow. And there's nothing wrong with moving on as long as moving on is moving forward. And even for those who label themselves as not spiritual, atheist, agnostic, whatever it might be, I still believe that we are on a spiritual journey, and identifying what that means for us is all part of the journey. And so some of the key influences that I've experienced in my spiritual journey, I think I can go back to an assignment that I had in undergrad, where in a geography class, it was one of those general elective classes, we had to write a paper on the tragedy of the commons, Garrett Hardin's 1968 essay on the tragedy of commons, which discussed really looking at the limited resources in our environment and how population was factoring into that. On the surface, not really a spiritual dissertation at all, but for me, it really struck a chord and it really shaped my worldview to the point where I still have students in my exercise science classes explore the tragedy of the commons and how it plays a role for us in our personal health and in the healthcare system. But the tragedy of commons really kind of gave me an idea of how we need to be looking beyond self, and our own selfish interests are not the collective interests. And we need to focus on the more collective, other-centered interests. And so that has been a profound influence in my life, spiritually as well as physically. And another influence was the Worldwide Church of God and the Holy Days. To me, these all pointed to Jesus. They were Herbert Armstrong's interpretation of the Jewish holidays, but the observance of them really pointed me to what I later would kind of realize was the omega point that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin would talk about in his books. And, that's another major influence in my life is those readings where I understand paleontology, geology, and evolution, Darwinism, all have spiritual connections if we're willing to open our eyes and to look at them. And so it opened my eyes to just a deeper, fuller understanding of what it means to be spiritual. And in observing the Sabbath, just taking that time each week, having to, again, legalistically, but still purposefully recognizing that creation requires recovery and rest and rejuvenation. And if I'm going to be a functional human being, if I'm going to grow spiritually, physically, intellectually, emotionally, and socially, I need periodic rest. I need to pull myself away from my self-centeredness and become more other-centered. And so there were just so many different aspects of the Sabbath that will probably come to light as I continue through in this podcast and different guests and different conversations that we'll have. But it was very influential to me. Now, does that mean it was an absolute necessity for everyone to observe the Sabbath? I can't say that. I think everybody, again, has their journey. You might be a Sunday worshiper. You might not even be Christian. It's still part of a journey that brings us toward, again, when I keep talking about the omega point and this spiritual evolution that we are undergoing. And then there's Rob Bell and his Everything is Spiritual. I think that was a profound influence for me to examine how the physical and the spiritual are one, that the smaller we get in terms of looking at the universe down to the level of, the smallest physical structure that a physicist can identify, all the way up to the vastness and the expansiveness of the universe. Everything is connected and everything is spiritual. And it really underscored to me that we are connected. If I look at, the oxygen that I breathe in and the CO2 that I breathe out, those same oxygen molecules, those same CO2 molecules have at some point been constituents in somebody else's body. And, as we get down to the very heart of what makes us physical, we're left with space and energy. And what is that space and energy? That to me is the spiritual. And that's what I'm exploring and what I'm trying to learn. What is that spiritualness that is between the physical? And so geology, exercise physiology have been an influence for me, understanding the evolutionary process and how that intertwines with the creation process. Exercise physiology, principles of overload and specificity and how we grow really has underscored my spiritual understanding. And I know it seems a little bit odd that the more I study exercise physiology, the more spiritual I become. The more spiritual my teaching becomes as I study the spiritual aspects of living. And so I have been heavily influenced by the physical leading to the spiritual and vice versa. And teaching wellness as, both an undergrad or as a grad student and as a post-graduation, PhD individual, it has led me to a deeper and deeper understanding of what does wellness mean. And, traditionally wellness is labeled with various dimensions. I've kind of settled on the 5 model of wellness, which my friend Jay has labeled as SPIES, because I tend to emphasize the spiritual first, the spiritual, the physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. I've evolved over time in terms of my definition of what I call well-centered fitness, and this idea that our well-centeredness, our wellness is an asymptote, that we are growing towards perfection, but will never be perfect. But there is an interconnection between our spiritual, our physical, intellectual, emotional, and social wellness that requires that we grow all of them simultaneously toward a greater perfection. And I've tended toward, and I'll probably have an episode where I might dive into this a little bit deeper, but I've talked about the spiritual and the physical being more the foundation of a pyramid or a triangle, that they're the base that we start with in wellness, and they're interconnected. And the more I study into this, the more I experience this, the more I see that they are interconnected and they're not totally separate. In fact, as we evolve spiritually, we're seeing that the physical and the spiritual come together and become one. But we build off of these, the intellectual, the learning, the understanding, and being able to interpret the creation, the universe, the things that are going on around us, whatever information or whatever knowledge that might be, has to be founded on the physical and the spiritual. And then that leads us to understanding our emotional well-being. And without emotional well-being, it's nearly impossible to have healthy social connections. And those social connections are important and feed back to our spiritual and our physical. And so it's this ever-growing kind of pyramid of dimension that leads us to a greater, better self, which leads to a better, greater universe and creation. Who or what do I believe God is? I don't know. I just know that God, the creator, a cosmic purpose, however you want to label this higher power or cosmic force or deity, he, she, it is beyond my comprehension. And that's okay, because none of us have a full view of what God is or is not. And so I believe we all have just a glimpse of what we choose or what I choose to call God. And that glimpse isn't wrong. We're just seeing a slightly different view. We're just not seeing the wholeness of what, again, I would call God. So why am I a Christian? Well, in part because that is the faith into which I was born and raised. It is also the direction my spiritual journey has led me. To me, Christ is the compass that leads us to Teilhard's Omega point. My journey has led me to see that the spiritual and the physical are indeed one. They are inseparable. The universe is infinitely smaller and bigger than we can fathom. In the space between the smallest particles the quantum physicists can identify, and in the vastness of the universe explored by the astrophysicist, I find God. God, the cosmic purpose, as Philip Goff would label, is ultimately what unifies creation. This, to me, is love. It is consciousness. I believe that God is, and God is love. These are how God self-identifies in the Old and New Testament of the Christian Bible. God is the Alpha and the Omega. God says, I am, and God says, I am loved. Is holy God and holy man, according to Christian scriptures. He is the reunification of the spiritual and the physical. Do I fully understand this? Heck no. Does this mean salvation is only for the Christian believer? I honestly don't know. I know from experience that Christianity and all religion is horribly flawed. I do believe that Christ is the Omega point. What this means, I'm still learning. What about salvation? I believe the focus on salvation is one of the greatest weaknesses of the Christian faith. I favor John 3:17 over John 3:16. I believe salvation on the whole is greater than the salvation of the self. What all this means? It means we have a spiritual problem. It means that we have to keep exploring and growing. It means that our salvation as a species is dependent not on which religion is right. We're all wrong. It is dependent on learning how we are to become unified in love. Yes, we have a spiritual problem.